All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the webinar, A Practical Approach to Doing Applied Conversation Analysis with Jessica Lester and Michelle O'Reilly. This webinar is presented as part of our Sage Talks series, connecting you to influential authors one webinar at a time. Before we begin, we have a quick poll we'd like you to take. You should see it on the screen in front of you in just a minute. We'd like to know, how familiar are you with conversation analysis? We'll give you just a minute to answer that poll here on the screen in front of you. Always helpful to get to know our audience as we go into the presentation. I think we can go ahead and close that. What do we have? Oh, lots of beginners here today. Well, that's great. That's fantastic. And we do know that conversation analysis is becoming increasingly used. You are absolutely in the right place if you want to learn a little bit about conversation analysis today. All right. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers today. Jessica Nina Lester is an Associate Professor of Inquiry Methodology, Qualitative Research, in the School of Education at Indiana University, Bloomington. Dr. Lester has published over 50 peer-reviewed journal articles, as well as numerous books and book chapters focused on discourse and conversation analysis, disability studies, and more general concerns related to qualitative research. Dr. Michelle O'Reilly is an Associate Professor at the University of Leicester and a research consultant for Leicestershire Partnership NHS Trust. Michelle has a range of research interests including child mental health, neurodevelopmental conditions, family therapy, and research ethics. Michelle has published a range of articles focusing on children and mental health. Jessica and Michelle are co-authors of Applied Conversation Analysis, published by Sage in 2018. Now, today's webinar will run about an hour and will be recorded and archived for future viewing. We'll send out a link to view that recording in the coming weeks. If you have any problems with audio or viewing mode during the webinar, please use that Q&A box at the right of your screen and one of our helpful team members will get back to you ASAP. After the presentation, we're going to have some time for Q&A, so please also use that Q&A box to ask any questions to our speakers throughout the webinar. Please also take note of the webinar hashtag, SageTalks. Feel free to ask questions and have conversations on Twitter. In today's discussion, Jessica and Michelle will illustrate the value of analyzing conversations in applied settings. Drawing upon conversation analysis, they highlight how to use this particular approach to design and carry out studies in the real world. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our speakers, and Jessica is going to begin our presentation today, so I'll hand it over to Jessica. Welcome, Jessica.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Susanna, for your introduction, and thank you to the Sage team. We're really pleased to be with you today and to be sharing a bit about applied conversation analysis. Broadly, our plan is first to offer a really brief overview of conversation analysis, and more particularly applied CA. Then, to make these ideas really concrete, Michelle is going to walk us through an actual example from start to finish of a study that she's been leading in the United Kingdom. And then after this, I'll offer a few practical tips for both learning to do conversation analysis, as well as for those of you that might be thinking about or already engaged in teaching conversation analysis, I'll provide a few ways to think about how you might think about teaching CA within the context of a variety of modules. To get us started, however, let's take a look at one of the central ideas of Harvey Sachs. Now, Harvey Sachs is the individual who is most commonly credited as being the pioneer or originator of conversation analysis. So Sachs argued that if we are to really understand and analyze participants' own concepts and accounts, we should aim to study them in their everyday, ordinary environments. In other words, rather than asking people about their activities, Sachs argued that we should seek to go to the actual places where they're engaged in their everyday activities. This idea of turning to actual context, the spaces where people are going about their business, as the site to study social life is really at the core of conversation analysis. And also, this was a really radical idea within American sociology at the time that Harvey Sachs and others were first beginning to think about and foregrounding really the value of turning to people's everyday actions as the source of understanding society. So building on this, a few points related to conversation analysis, which we'll be referring to from here on out as just CA. So what is CA? So at its core, CA is a qualitative methodology that focuses on talk in interaction. And more particularly, it's helpful to keep in mind that CA attends to the sequential order of talk. So to put that more simply, we can think about CA as aiming to understand how social actors are making sense of and responding to one another in their turns of talk, in their conversational turns, that is. So a conversation analyst is particularly interested in the interactional organization of everyday, as well as in some cases, institutional activities, meaning that they are really interested in the way that people perform social actions with language. And it's important to recognize that social actions here refer to the performative aspects of talk. In other words, the way people do things with their talk, such as through our talk we make excuses, we offer invitations, we proffer a complaint, we ask questions, so on and so on. In other words, our talk is always doing something. Another key feature of CA is that it most often involves the study of naturally occurring data, which really can be defined as data that exists regardless of the existence or presence of a researcher. So as an example of this, everyday interactions around a dinner table or therapy talk at a mental health clinic are both examples of potential data that exists regardless of whether a researcher is present. So this idea of naturally occurring data really stands in contrast to what's often referred to as researcher-generated data, such as interviews or focus groups, data that's dependent upon a researcher to produce it. So some of the key messages or characteristics of CA that are important to always keep in mind are, number one, this idea of staying really close to the phenomenon of interest by focusing on the detail of an interactional event. So you attend to the nuances of interaction, you produce a detailed transcript, and most often conversation analysts use a method referred to as Jeffersonian transcription. So the Jeffersonian method was developed initially by Gail Jefferson, who worked closely with Harvey Sachs. And this kind of transcript really seeks to represent both what is said as well as how things are said. So things like aspirations, intonation, pauses and gaps, et cetera, are all included as representations within the transcript. And we'll see an example of this when Michelle shares a little bit of her data. So the aim of this kind of transcript is really to attend to as much vocal, verbal, and when possible, multimodal detail of the interaction. And to do this, a variety of symbols are used to represent these various aspects of the interaction. Another key message within CA is, as I already noted, that it really favors naturally occurring data. And there's a real purpose in this. And it really is because conversation analysts conceive of talk as being a situated achievement rather than a product of an artificial experiment or even a researcher's intentions. A third thing to keep in mind is that CA assumes that talk is orderly and that we can actually study that order or structure. We can study then the sequential organization of talk. And then finally, it's important to keep in mind that CA studies language as it is used within real-world interactions, and therefore the focus is on what's often referred to as talk in use. So what does all this mean? Well, for those of us that draw upon CA, the focus is really on what people are actually doing and saying, rather than what people report that they're doing and saying. There's also a focus on, within the interaction between people, the ways in which meanings are negotiated on a turn-by-turn or conversational basis. To better understand what we're referring to as applied CA, it's helpful to develop a bit of understanding around the initial focus of conversation analysts. So the initial focus of conversation analysts in the early days was really to study mundane or ordinary conversations. As an example of such a conversation, you might consider an everyday conversation between two friends at a coffee shop as being ordinary, or a dinner time conversation with a partner. In other words, it is the talk that occurs between people without any real organizational task or focus that was that early focus of conversation analysts. And we can contrast this kind of interaction with what's referred to as institutional talk, or the talk that not only takes place in an institutional setting like a medical clinic or a classroom, but also deals with an institutional task, such as diagnosing a child or teaching a lesson. So it's really important to understand that institutional interactions have characteristics that set them apart from everyday interactions and make them really distinct and explicitly linked to the institutional space in which they are being produced. So to build upon this idea of institutional talk further, it's important to clarify that Sachs and his colleagues in the early days originally developed CA as an effort to produce what is often referred to as a peer science, one where conversation analysts study how social action is brought about in and through conversation. In fact, Sachs in the early days of CA did not deliberately intend for CA to have an application. However, CA researchers really sought to apply their findings to areas of practice, and we saw then this emergence of applied CA. So when we think about applied CA, it's helpful to keep a few things in mind. So first off, applied CA can be the application of the findings of peer CA studies to the studies of institutional interactions. As an example, one might study interactions that occur in a school or a hospital and look at these interactions through an application of the general work produced in traditional CA literature, such as looking at how adjacency pairs work in a classroom interaction. A second thing to keep in mind is that applied CA can be thought of as including the efforts that are involved in applying CA findings to offer really practical advice to organizations or people's practices. Michelle's going to actually offer us an example of that. And I'll just say as a side note, Charles Antaki has done some additional writing around the ways in which we conceptualize applied CA as having a variety of different types or approaches. We're not going to get into that today. However, this might be a useful thing to explore if you're interested. So thinking about the phases of an applied CA project, it's important to keep in mind that this is an iterative process, much like qualitative work in general. However, when designing and carrying out an applied CA study, of course there's this early engagement with the literature base. There's also planning for data collection, which often involves considering really unique ethical considerations specific to your study, and that are often quite particular to naturally occurring data. And as I already mentioned, CA also involves a specialized transcription system and a very particular way of analyzing data. And for some scholars in the present day, it also entails really leveraging the ways in which digital tools can support both the collection of data and the analytic process. And of course, generating a quality study is of importance to all of us, and it involves several key considerations. And then finally, Michelle and I both have written about this and argue that a key aspect of applied CA is really careful planning and execution of disseminating the work in ways that reaches key stakeholders, key partners. So to make these ideas even more concrete, Michelle is going to share an example of an actual study that she's been leading. So I'm going to pass it over to Michelle.
Great. Thank you, Jessica, and welcome to the audience. It's really lovely to have you with us today. It's great to know that there's such interest in applied CA out there. As Jessica said, we're going to be kind of going through an actual project example that I've been leading over here in the UK, but that Jessica has been working with me on this project. So hopefully we can bring CA to life a little bit for you. So just to give you a little bit of context, the data that we collected was British data, so it occurred in the British context. And over here we have specialised child and adolescent mental health services that are not that different to other mental health clinics around the world. And when parents are concerned about the mental health of their child, if they think their child has got some kind of mental health difficulty, they go to the general practitioner who does a referral to this clinic. And what happens then is they have an initial screening assessment to determine whether there is or isn't a problem. And there are kind of a series of different types of possible outcomes from this screening assessment. They might decide that there is definitely some kind of mental health problem present and refer into the clinic for proper diagnosis and treatment. They might not be certain if there's a problem. After the hour and a half, they might kind of think, well, not really sure, and then they do a second assessment. So they call the family back in for another assessment, and they discuss it with senior colleagues and other members of the team. And sometimes it's just clear that there is no mental health problem, and so they discharge the family on those grounds. And what's really interesting about this project is that the way in which they talk to families, the kind of questions they ask, we would say that they're kind of universal. They're not culturally specific to the UK. And with that kind of interest, Jessica and I are hoping to repeat this study over in the US to look at the kind of screening initial assessments that go on over there for mental health problems. What was really interesting about this work is that we came to the problem from a clinically driven point of view, because I was working in the NHS, which is the National Health Service in England, with some clinical practitioners. And they were saying that they didn't really have much evidence to support their clinical work in terms of mental health assessments. And when I explored the literature, it was really lacking there as well. So it was a very clinically driven study in the first instance. But like all research, all types of research, there's quite a stringent ethics process if you're looking at child mental health. And we went through the NHS ethics process, which was a very long, robust process. But we did manage to recruit 28 families, and that reflected the general clinic intake. Our youngest child was 6, our oldest child was 17, and the service sees them from 5 to 18, so that was quite representative. As Jessica pointed out, the data was naturally occurring. We were really fortunate that the rooms had video equipment set up in the clinic. So with the appropriate consent, we were able to video record these families having their assessment, which lasted approximately 90 minutes each family. And of course, the whole purpose of this then was to apply conversation analysis to it. So once we Jeffersonized the transcripts, we were kind of all set to go. So what I want to do now, if Jessica can move the slide on, I just want to go through some of the processes that we applied to our project. And it's quite interesting if you kind of get to know the CA literature a little bit. You'll see that there's a bit of resistance in trying to take a kind of step-by-step process, practical way of doing CA. But some eminent CA scholars have shared their general steps, and Paul Drew from Loughborough University has done so in his work, and he points out these kind of 8 very general steps for doing CA, and this is the kind of process that Jessica and I have followed in terms of looking at the mental health assessments. And as Jessica mentioned earlier, one of the key things you do is you look for social actions. That's the what talk is doing bit that she referred to earlier. But you look at those social actions in terms of the turn-taking sequences, in terms of how one speaker responds to another speaker who responds to another speaker. And of course, in these family interactions, there could be as many as 6 or 7 people in the room, including the children themselves. The idea is then you examine the details and identify particular phenomena of interest, looking at how those utterances are responded to by the different interlocutors in the room. And the kind of key thing in CA is to look for shared features across the example. It's very unusual to just have one example of something. You start to see patterns across your data, and you then collect together those cases that you've identified. And one of the really important aspects of CA then is to account for that pattern as you write up your findings. So you're really showing what's going on in the data. You attend very closely to the data. You're looking at the sequences of conversation. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you some examples of some of the findings from this project. And we have written this up quite extensively, and all the publications are on my webpage if anyone's interested in looking at those papers. But I'm just going to draw your attention to just a few of these in this webinar. One of the really interesting things we did is we used the CA to provide a coding frame and do some counting, which is one of the things you can do, and we have something in the book about how to do that. And we created a taxonomy of questions, and we actually counted the frequency of those questions. And what it boiled down to is that these mental health practitioners were asking one question every 15 seconds, which took us by surprise really, because that's 4 questions per minute across a 90-minute assessment. So you can really start to see just how much of the assessment is constituted by questions. Also, they used various techniques, kind of child-friendly techniques. Things like asking the child what they would do if they had 3 wishes. If you had 3 wishes, what would you wish for? And they also used these subjective units of distress on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you? What was really interesting about the subjective units of distress was if they used a dichotomous emotion, it wasn't very successful. So if they said, on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you? 1 is sad, 10 is happy. Then the child always went around the middle, around 5. And when we discussed this with clinicians afterwards, they could see that actually that wasn't the most effective way of finding out about children's emotions. But in terms of engaging children, you said X formulations were very successful. And by that we mean that if they preface the question with you said and then whatever it was that was said, then the child would give much longer, more elaborate answers to the question than if they just asked the question. So that was quite a practical finding. Another really interesting aspect of this project data was to talk about self-harm. So when you're doing a mental health assessment, it's really key to ask about risk, self-harm, suicide, but asking those kind of delicate questions of children is quite tricky. So I'm going to talk you through an example now by giving you some examples from the data set itself. But just to let you know that the text on the slide in a second is a little bit small, but you can download the PowerPoint. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk you through a couple of the key things off this slide and then off the next one so you get a general sense of it. Well, what we found particularly helpful is that when practitioners asked about self-harm and suicide, they did it in one of 2 ways, and this is the first way that they did it. And this was a kind of incremental building, and by paying attention to the sequential order of the questions and answers, we can really see how it's incrementally built. So if you look at the first couple of lines, the practitioner starts off with a very general thing. Is there another way you show your frustration? And the child says he hits doors. And that gets built up to or hurting yourself as a kind of tentative inquiry, and the child says yes. So the practitioner pursues a bit more detail, and the child actually confesses that he slit his wrists once. And of course that then provides the foundation to really pursue that self-harming and suicidal ideation in this particular child. But it's built very incrementally, and the sequential order enables us to look at that quite particularly. But in the next example that we're going to show you, on the next slide, it wasn't quite as straightforward as that. So sometimes there isn't anything in the child's referral notes that gives the clinicians any sense that there is a risk. So the other way in which they ask self-harm questions is to kind of do a bit of normalizing to make the question sound like it's not just coming out of nowhere. And you should hopefully be able to see this a little bit better because the text is a little larger. But the practitioner says to this child, this is a question we have to ask everybody, and I'm sure you've been asked it before. So rather than incrementally build something up, they kind of just provide this, well, you know, we're being pushed into doing this. This is just a normal question. And the child says, no, I haven't. I've never thought about hurting myself. So I'm going to move on now and just give you a little bit of a sense of what came out of this project. And one of the things that Jessica and I have always advocated is that if you're doing this applied CA, it means you're working with practitioners of some kind, whether they're educationalists, mental health practitioners, social workers, whoever they might be. And so actually the outputs and the dissemination should benefit them in some way. And what we did in our work is we disseminated to both the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service itself and to academics. The mental health practitioners were really quite surprised at just how simple some of the lessons could be from CA. They were also very surprised by how many questions that were asked in an assessment, and they said they wanted to read some of the papers, so we've passed those on. Academics, we have disseminated to a range of academics. some who were CA friendly, some who'd never heard of it. But they were quite inspired by the creativity of the approach, the way in which interrogating data so closely gave them something a little bit different to ordinary qualitative research. And they were very, very keen on this idea of using naturally occurring data. And they could really see the value of paying such a close attention to communication, particularly in health settings, because that was the example we were setting up. So I really hope that that's been helpful to you. I'm going to pass back over to Jessica now, and she's going to work you through some kind of practical tips for both doing and teaching CA. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle. So just to offer some practical steps in connection to thinking about how to learn conversation analysis, a really important thing to keep in mind is that to understand conversation analysis, you really have to do it. So yes, it's important to engage deeply with seminal readings and some of the more contemporary texts, but it's also important to give yourself plenty of time to actually practice analyzing data from this particular perspective. So it's helpful to keep in mind that as a specialist method, it certainly does take time and commitment to learn how to carry out an applied conversation analysis study. So you learn by doing. So practice, practice, practice is really the core tip and thing to always keep in mind when you're thinking about how to become more skilled at carrying out such a study. It's also really important to plan to listen to data and engage with your data again and again and again as you aim to maintain a closeness to your data set. Creating that quality transcript, the Jeffersonian transcript, also takes time. It takes time to learn that approach to generating a transcript, and it also simply takes a lot of time to produce that kind of transcript. And that also supports the ways in which you become close to your data and also allows for a more quality analysis. Other things to keep in mind as you begin to actually engage in data sessions and work with data, it is incredibly helpful to work with individuals who might have more experience in conversation analysis. So working in group data sessions is an invaluable opportunity to hone your conversation analytic skills and also become familiar with other kinds of data and other things that might come to the fore as you engage with a variety of data types. Ways that you can practically do this, there are a variety of short courses that are offered in both the North American context, as well as there are a plethora of courses offered in the UK. I've just listed a few of these here. So Rutgers University has a conversation analysis lab that hosts CA workshops every year, and they are readily available and opened for outsiders to come in for typically a 2 to 3 day workshop focused on a particular aspect of conversation analysis. There are also a variety of institutions in the UK that host similar opportunities. A wonderful website to access updated trainings is the EMCA wiki site that I have listed here on this PowerPoint slide. Trainings are updated regularly and are opportunities that are really important things to take advantage of if you want to commit to really learning the practice of engaging in a conversation analysis study. If you're intending to teach conversation analysis, there are, of course, a variety of course designs that you might pursue. You might teach a full-on course of conversation analysis. You might envision integrating conversation or applied conversation analysis into a discourse analysis class. Another and perhaps most common approach that you might take is you may be teaching an introductory qualitative research course, and applied conversation analysis and more broadly conversation analysis might simply be one module within your course or 1 week within your course. These are different designs that I've taught in my own practice, and I'm happy to share the various syllabi for those that might be engaged in similar practice. Feel free to reach out for those. But across these designs, one thing that both Michelle and I have learned over the years is really helpful for students is to engage in weekly data sessions. This again gets back to this idea of to learn how to do conversation analysis, you actually just have to do it. So having weekly data sessions is really helpful. And in planning to do so, obviously you have to think about what kinds of data might I use. Of course, you can tap your own data sets if you have the ethical clearance to do so. You can also tap a variety of public data sources, such as news interviews that are publicly available. There are also a variety of data banks that can be accessed, such as the Talk Bank is one example. The Talk Bank is an excellent bank of conversational data that those that want to practice with real data, real everyday conversations, can access these data sources and integrate them into their courses. In addition to that, the EMCA wiki site that I mentioned previously also has resources specific to teaching, including some additional ideas related to the kinds of data that you might incorporate. Another important thing that has been really helpful, particularly with the advancements of digital tools in qualitative inquiry, is to begin to think about the ways in which you can integrate digital tools into the teaching of conversation analysis. So obviously, with the collection of naturally occurring data, it's important for students to begin to think about the various recording devices that they can leverage to record naturally occurring data. And so making this a part of your course is a really important aspect of those early introductions to data collection. With transcription being such a mainstay practice within conversation analysis, the variety of digital tools that can support that process are also important to tap. Things such as IngScribe, Transana, and many other resources are really useful tools to introduce to students and can serve to support them as they begin developing really detailed transcripts. And then, of course, when possible, if your institution have access to computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software, this is one way wherein students can both gain experience in the use of such software and also begin to think about how such software can serve to organize as well as support the analytic process of an applied CA study. We also wanted to offer just a few helpful starting points for those of you that might be new to CA, as well as those that might not be necessarily new but are thinking about going more deeply into conversation analysis or thinking about where to start in preparing to teach an applied CA or CA class. So we've offered here on the slide some seminal texts. Sachs, of course, his lectures on conversation are a really inspiring as well as thought-provoking way to enter into conversation analysis. Sindel and Stivers have also produced a more recent handbook of conversation analysis that provides some seminal ideas and some contemporary thought around core concepts within CA. There are also a plethora of pedagogical CA texts that are available, and we've listed a few that are particularly useful for us in our own work as well as in our teaching. And then there's been far less writing around applied CA texts. However, Charles Antaki, who I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, has put together an edited volume wherein he has pulled together scholars that provide a variety of examples of applied CA projects. So I'm going to close now and turn it back over to the SAGE team to field some questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jessica and Michelle. That was an information-packed half hour, and we really appreciate you giving such a great talk today. So for the rest of our time together, we are going to spend it addressing questions from the audience. Thank you to those of you who have already been sending in questions. We really appreciate that, and we will hopefully be able to get to all of them. If you have a question currently, or if one comes up throughout the duration of the rest of our time together, folks, feel free, put in a question in that Q&A box to the right of your screen. You can also go on Twitter using the hashtag SageTalks. We'll be scanning that for any questions. And if by any chance we're not able to get to all of these questions today, Jessica and Michelle have kindly agreed to address them later in a follow-up blog post on MethodSpace, Sage's online community. All right, let's begin. So just to kick things off, we heard an example of an applied CA study that Michelle gave from her background. And I was wondering, Jessica, if you would like to provide maybe an example from your world in education, just to give the audience a little bit of context on how it's worked for you in education.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So first off, most of my work does span in the area of either educational context or mental health, and so I'm going to offer a more specific educational context example. In the last few years, I've done quite a few projects that have actually attended to the ways in which CA might be leveraged to make sense of online discussion forums in the context of nutrition education classes as well as qualitative research classes that are online. And these studies have focused specifically on using data that is produced within the context of courses. These are all courses that I do not teach specifically, but these data sets were essentially online textual-based data sets. Some of them do have a great deal of visual data as well, such as emojis and images that are incorporated. And the kinds of questions that are posed range from the ways in which students make learning visible within these contexts. We know that increasingly educational contexts are being required in some cases to use predominantly online venues for transmitting information. So much of this work has attended to the ways in which learning is produced sequentially in the interaction, as well as the ways in which identities, student identities, are conveyed and made sense of and negotiated within these particular contexts. How do students produce expertise? How do students distance themselves from expertise? And I'll just say that this kind of data is the kind of data that is important to think about really carefully methodologically. I mean, conversation analysis was originally designed for talk-based data, and so the application of conversation analysis to textual data brings with it a variety of methodological tension points. And that's one thing that I also am continuing to think through in my own work, and I know that there are many others that are interested in exploring that as well as this kind of data becomes more and more prevalent.
All right, thank you. We have a couple of questions about the transcription slide, and I know we can't go back to it on our screen here, but folks, you know what I'm talking about, the one that had the script. A couple of people just had questions about the Jeffersonian transcription. You know, what is that information that's captured and how is it denoted? We also had a question about the underlined portions of the text. Michelle, I was wondering if you could give a little bit of background on the Jeffersonian transcript and you know, share a little more detail about that with our audience here.
Yes, certainly. I mean, Jefferson worked alongside Harvey Sachs in the early days, and one of the things that Sachs really wanted to be able to do was to create a transcription system that captured not just what was said by participants, but how it was said. And the idea in conversation analysis is that certain things can be interactionally relevant, and if they're not represented in the transcript, then the audience who's maybe reading the paper, because that's the most common way of transmitting academic information, won't necessarily understand or see that point. So a classic example of this, one of the things that's often cited, is pauses in conversation. And of course in mental health settings, pauses in therapy can be really interactionally relevant, but they can be quite telling. If people hesitate before they give an answer, it can signal some kind of trouble in the talk. So if you don't capture that in the transcript, you're not representing what was said in a completely accurate way. But of course there's a range of symbols that have grown. Alexa Hepburn and Galena Bolden have done some additional work since Jefferson's original transcription, and they've started to examine even nuanced stuff about laughter, the different ways and sounds that laughter projects as it sounded, and crying and sniffing, and all of that that's kind of like, they're not words, but they're still interactionally relevant sounds and part of the interaction, and capturing those in a transcript can be quite tricky. I think the one thing I would say is that it takes a long time to do Jefferson. And conversation analysts recommend you do your own transcription. That's not always feasible, and what we did for the mental health project was that we paid a professional transcriptionist to produce the verbatim transcript, but then as professional CA people we added the Jeffersonian symbols to that. And it's always a work in progress. Every time you write a paper you really have to listen to those extracts of data again and make sure that you're representing it truly as it was sounded. I hope that's answered the question, Susanna.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly time intensive. How long did it take you to get a feel for how to do this?
I started learning how to do it when I did my PhD, I guess. And it took a long time to learn how to do it. I was very fortunate. I was trained by the people at Loughborough University, Derek Edwards, Jonathan Potter, Charles Antaki, some quite key people in the field, and Elizabeth Stokoe as well. But as Jessica said in the webinar, you learn by doing. The more you listen to data, the more attuned you become to listening to the different ways in which people emphasize or rise intonation or pause or take breath in and out. And as you become more familiar with the symbols themselves, you really become entrenched in them. So when I take them out now for practitioner papers, I often miss them because I just don't see them on the page anymore. And I have to get other people to check that I've taken all the symbols out of the transcripts to make them a bit more readable for people who don't know what they're doing with it.
Wow. Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. Okay, I have a question that I'd like to pose to both of you. Jessica, you can start answering first. How does the principles of informed consent function when the settings are every day? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one of those gray questions where it's a bit murky. So it depends on what the everyday is referring to. So obviously there are some contexts that the data itself is considered public, and this is the case. We see this quite often also with some ethnographic work that is focused in public contexts, like for instance, those that focus predominantly in the study of library spaces. Those are very public spaces, and whether or not they need consents for everyone walking into those doors. Is it something that you could say yes or no to? And in fact, ethics boards, IRBs, say yes or no. Sometimes they say no. They're fully public spaces. But in general, when you're going to record people's interactions, there is an invasive quality to that. And so the introduction of a recording device often does require some level of consent being invited by the participants. So for instance, I'm thinking about the wonderful work of Sally Wiggins, who was focused on food practices, and much of her data, which has been collected over many years, has attended to the everyday mundane conversations that happen amongst families as they're having dinner. And those families consented to participate in this study and consented for her to collect the data. And so in general, when you're going to involve some kind of recording device, it is important to recognize that that often, by and large, requires you to think about inviting consent. Michelle, do you want to build on that further?
Yeah, so it's quite an interesting question. The ethics question's always tricky, I think, but with mundane conversations, one of the ways around the consent issue is that you provide the control to your participants. So, for example, in the work that of Sally that Jessica was referring to, you as a researcher don't necessarily need to be present when the recording is happening. So if you give families control of the recording device, they choose when to press record and when to press stop. So they're fully in control of what space you get to see as a researcher later. And even with the institutional stuff, there's an element of this to some extent. So in the example I presented, we had full informed consent of all parties at the very beginning of the mental health assessment. But we took it again at the end of the assessment in case anybody had changed their mind. Because the problem with it is they don't know when they say yes at the beginning if they're going to raise something that they later don't want a researcher to hear. So another way around this is kind of pre and post consent, where you take it before the recording and again at the end when you have it.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. And then following up on that question, how do you make sure that the data is actually representative of an institution, what you've collected in a normal, non-remarkable setting? Jessica, you want to start that one?
Sure. Yeah, that's another interesting question. In some ways, it's a loaded question, too, because what counts as representative? We, from our various kind of methodological and theoretical positions, we can answer that in various ways. But one thing to keep in mind is that for many conversation analysts, one of the things that, not always, but one of the things that is pursued in Michelle's example that she offered is an example of this, is that a single case is not being collected. So rather than, for instance, in Michelle's example, she could have just collected one mental health assessment, and the degree to which we would have been able to make claims around patterns in the data as well as variability of those patterns would have obviously been quite limited. So one of the things that conversation analysts do is collect what might be conceived of as relatively large data sets. And this could range anywhere from 15 hours of talk or 15 hours of interaction. And then in many cases, there are those that build up data sets upwards of several hundred hours. Saying that, however, there is a precedence to also work with 1 or 2 hours of talk, and whether you make a claim that this is representative will obviously be dictated in some ways by the focus of your work, but your goals within this work might not be to argue for representation of this interaction as being something that happens across an institutional or everyday space, but rather to illustrate a really nuanced and potentially even unique aspect of this single case of an interaction. So depending on the scope and the focus, you might approach this notion of representativeness in varying ways, but the size of the data set is one of the ways that you might make sense of that argument. Michelle, would you add further?
Yeah, I think that's really important, Jessica. What you said is that you're not always aiming for representativeness, and that actually a single case is really interesting to conversation analysts, and you can identify quite a lot of really rich and interesting things from one single case. So your kind of objective of your research really does matter. I mean, in our case, we wanted to represent the service, and so we were very fortunate. There were 29 mental health practitioners who worked in the assessment service, and all 29 of them agreed to participate. They all signed the consent forms, and they were all captured on video at least once. So in that sense, we represented that service because we had all of the mental health practitioners on board. And then because it was naturally occurring data really does help with representativeness as well, because you're capturing natural things that occur generally and all the time. So whilst we did have some families who said no to us, we had 28 families who said yes to us. And when we did the kind of general statsy stuff of, the average age of the child, the average length of the assessment, all those kind of things, that reflected what actually goes on in those clinics. The youngest was 6, the oldest was 17. Well, they range from 5 to 18 in that clinic, but they don't really see very many 5-year-olds, and they don't see very many 18-year-olds. So we really captured the age group, we captured the range of professional disciplines, and each assessment was about 90 minutes. We had over 2,000 minutes worth of data. So our goal in our project was representing what really happens in practice, but that's not necessarily always the case. And sometimes it's about transferability. When you look at some CA practices, like the original work of Harvey Sachs, who noted that adjacency pairs occur in conversation, that when one person speaks, another responds. He didn't really need much data to be able to make that kind of claim, and then you translate it and transfer it across context, and you find actually that happens in a lot of places. So hopefully that's answered the question.
All right, thank you. What do you think about approaching conversations, quote-unquote conversations, that occur on social media, like comments and responses on posts with CA? Do you think that's actually more text analysis, or can you apply those CA principles when analyzing social media? Michelle, I guess I'll pose that to you.
And that's a really tricky question, and Jessica pointed to it herself just a little while ago when she talked about the tensions it creates in the CA field as to whether you can apply CA to text or not. It hasn't been done very much so far, and I think that's because it's known as talk and interaction, and what you have in social media is asynchronous talk to some extent in terms of things like instant messenger on Facebook posts and blog responses and things like that. So it's a form of interaction. So I would argue that there are ways to apply CA to it, but I've only ever applied DA to it. Discourse analysis has always lent itself more readily to text than CA has. But I think we live in a digital age. Social media is taking over, and conversations, and we do put the little inverted commas around that, over social media via text are growing, and they are a form of interaction, and so it'll be interesting to see what conversation analysts do with that over forthcoming years. Jessica, would you like to add to that?
Sure, yeah, it's a really interesting question. I'll just say that there has been some interesting methodological writing around this, and there's also a network referred to as MOOD, the microanalysis of online data, that was begun several years ago out of basically this question. A group of scholars, I was one of them, were at a conference, and we realized that there were some really interesting methodological tensions that were raised when we began applying and thinking about applying conversation analysis to particularly asynchronous data, so textual data. And so works that might be useful to turn to. Joanne Meredith has done some writing around the analysis of Facebook data using a conversation analysis. Wikström's done quite a bit of work on eChat, counseling chat rooms. David Giles has done some writing as well, as Trina Paulus has focused specifically on Twitter data as well as online discussions. But a useful starting place, some colleagues and I, David Giles, Wikström, Trina Paulus, and Darren Reed, in 2015, we published a piece called Microanalysis of Online Data, and we talked about in that piece, the methodological piece, the possibilities for a digital orientation to conversation analysis. And in that piece, we do tackle some of the tensions of applying a perspective that was initially developed to analyze hearable talk. And so we argue in this piece that CA is fundamentally useful, but it does require us to engage in some careful thought around where can we leverage the utility of CA and how can we use CA to actually understand some nuanced aspects of the structure of talk that might be unique and a variety of new and emergent spaces. So all this to say it's a really interesting question, and it's a question that I don't think is going to go away, and there's a burgeoning number of scholars who are playing with these ideas and beginning to apply CA to a variety of online contexts.
Okay, thank you. Michelle, when you were giving your example, you mentioned that the clinic that you were working in had video recorded data. And how do you extend CA to capture nonverbal communication? Is that even possible, or how do you convey the nonverbal cues within the context of CA?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of work on this actually, and there's some interesting literature by Christian Heath about the use of video for different types of analysis, but including CA. And you know, if we look at the kind of clinical literature and the cognitive literature and things like that, they say that, you know, there's a huge portion of communication that is nonverbal. And conversation analysts for quite a while now have also agreed that actually social interaction does involve the use of gesture, the use of eye gaze, pointing, etc. And I've done some work in autism, research with children who have autism, and quite a lot of their social interaction involves nonverbal. And if you're going to capture that, then you need video, because so much of the stuff goes on. And what's really interesting, Paul Dickerson did some great work with autistic children and robots, and one of the things he was really interested in is how the children interacted with the robot using eye gaze and pointing, and so all of his data was video-based data to be able to capture that. Transcribing that, that's even more labour-intensive than just the traditional Jeffersons transcript, because you then have to capture the exact moment at which the child's head shifts to the right or the left, and the direction of their eye and who they're looking at, where the finger is pointing. All of that kind of non-verbal gesturing has to be captured. But there is a big literature on multimodal interaction, on embodiment, on gaze. Chuck Goodwin has written quite some very interesting stuff around nonverbal in social interaction. But even perfectly verbal people, like in my mental health clinics data, the children did a lot of pointing, and even subtle things like the mental health practitioner would just shift their body slightly in the direction of the child and lean forward a couple of inches when they asked the child a question, so that it was clear that the next speaker selection was the child, and then they didn't always have to use the child's name to do that, because the nonverbal indicated that the next speaker was to be the child. So capturing that transcription-wise, that's very time-consuming, but when you're really interested in that kind of side of things, it shows some very interesting things, particularly with certain groups like autistic kids. Jessica, have you got anything you want to add on that?
I would just add that the scholars that Michelle mentioned are really great resources to turn to, and they have excellent examples of embodied transcripts that can illustrate the ways in which you can think about transcribing beyond just producing a letter on a page, of thinking about how the visual aspects of embodiment might also be represented in the context of a transcript.
Okay, thank you. We have one last question submitted by our audience. If you want to take just 2 to 3 minutes between the two of you to address this final question. What about forms of talk that may not involve turn-taking, like lectures, lab demonstrations, etc.? Are there any considerations on how you do CA in those situations? I guess we can, whichever one of you feels compelled to answer that, please feel free.
Sure, I'll go ahead and start, and then I'll turn it to Michelle. There's actually been quite a bit of work around that. So if we think about lectures, lectures are an interesting kind of talk. And as was mentioned by the audience member, there's not the traditional turn-by-turn aspect of the structure. There's some writing around lectures. There's some seminal pieces that have attended to that from like a Goffman kind of perspective as well. And so there's some examples of attending to that. One of the assumptions of that kind of talk is, okay, so there might not be the traditional turn-by-turn, but we still can attend to the nature of the unique structure of that kind of interaction. And so one of the things that's really useful about CA, and we could say this of online data as well, so what happens when we don't have the normative expected turn-by-turn interaction? We can make sense of what is different there. And so attending to those differences can really tease out the nuances that might mark talk as lecture-based talk, or might mark talk as an online interaction wherein people have no expectation. It's not a normative expectation that they respond in asynchronous interactions as the same way they would in an everyday interaction. In fact, in some forum sites, you see the next turn in the conversation happen months later, or even in some cases a year later. And so all this to say, I would argue that conversation analysis is really useful to making sense of the nuances of language, including the ways in which the very notion of turns might be produced in different ways and or not produced. Michelle?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. And I also think what is really interesting about those kinds of interactions is they are still an interaction. So CA still has a lot to offer. And I think kind of sticking with that lecture example, that there's still merit in examining the talk because the speaker is still engaging a second party. So it might be a silent second party, but they're still present in the lecture theatre, or even like this webinar today, we're not speaking with the audience, they're not speaking to us directly, and yet we're engaging a number of people. And so the way in which we speak, the content of our talk, the interaction still has a communication, engagement, interaction aspect to it. And what's really interesting is we can still look at how tone shifts We can still look at pauses. We can still look at the kind of sequential structure of the talk. There will still be that kind of institutional task being performed. The talk will still be doing something performative. The social actions will still be interesting and present. And CA can still lend itself to that and can still examine those slightly more one-sided social interactions.
Okay, well, thank you. I think that's a perfect way to leave it today, and that's about all the time we have. Thank you so much, Jessica and Michelle. What a great talk, and thank you so much for your insightful comments. We are just about done here. If you're interested in purchasing Jessica and Michelle's book, Applied Conversation Analysis, you can use that code on the screen in front of you, APPCA, like Applied Conversation Analysis, on sagepub.com for a 20% discount for the next 2 weeks, good through September 21st. And of course, if you're an instructor and you're considering one of these books for use in a course, you can feel free to request a copy at sagepub.com as well. All right, thanks again everyone for joining us. Special thank you to authors Jessica Lester and Michelle O'Reilly. Thanks also to our behind the scenes team helping run the webinar. Please be on the lookout for an email that will include a recording of today's webinar, slides, and any questions we didn't have time to get to today. Please stay connected with us for information on upcoming webinars and follow us on Twitter at @sage_methods. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day.